Clara's voice come soft, measured, the way someone speaks when remembering cold that went beyond temperature into philosophy. In the winter of 1887, Jacob Kresge stood outside his cabin in Minnesota and faced a choice that most men never have to make. The thermometer nailed to his door read 18 degrees below zero, and it was still morning. His family of 5 was burning 9 cords of firewood a month. 9 cords. At his location, a cord of wood cost roughly 30 cents. That meant $2.70 every single month, just for heat, which was nearly a quarter of his annual income of $15. His wife, Anna, had stopped complaining about the cold. That's when Jacob knew things had gone past difficult into genuinely dangerous territory. When Anna stopped complaining, it meant she'd moved past anger into a flat resignation that precedes surrender. The cabin was a modest structure by frontier standards, roughly 20 by 15 feet, with walls of hand-notched pine logs sealed with mud chinking and straw. A wood stove sat in the center of the main room, a massive cast-iron creature that weighed 412 pounds. Jacob had measured it carefully on an old scale one winter morning when he couldn't sleep and needed to understand the mathematics of what was slowly killing them. The stove stood roughly 4 feet tall and 3 feet wide, with intricate designs cast into its surface, geometric patterns, ornamental feet shaped like bear paws, a door that opened to reveal a firebox lined with brick. When the fire was hot, the stove's surface glowed cherry red, but that glow only extended about 6 feet in any direction. Beyond that radius, the cabin was cold enough that breath hung in visible clouds, and the thermometer pinned to the interior wall showed temperatures that hovered between 35 and 40 degrees. Their daughter, Catherine, 14 years old, had taken to wearing nearly everything she owned at once: a dress, 2 pairs of wool stockings, a cardigan, and a shawl pinned at the shoulders with darning needles. Their son, Peter, 18, slept in the kitchen near the stove because the bedroom was simply too cold to survive in for 8 hours. Jacob and Anna slept in shifts, one always awake to tend the fire, because if it went out during the night, the house would drop below freezing in just 2 hours, and with children in the cabin, that could mean pneumonia, which meant death. The mathematics of frontier survival were unforgiving and precise. A growing child needed somewhere between 2,000 and 2,500 calories per day. Multiplied by 5 family members, that was roughly 12,000 calories daily, or 3,000 per person. Anna rationed their food with the precision of someone who knew that running short was not an inconvenience but a genuine threat. Bread was weighed. Preserved vegetables were measured out in precise portions, sometimes just a spoonful of turnips per plate. Jacob's own intake was deliberately reduced because he was the primary laborer, and if he got sick or injured, the whole family's survival became questionable. He was living on perhaps 1,600 calories a day while doing physical work that burned twice that, often 3 times that. By February, his belt had moved through 3 notches. He was becoming someone else, a hunger-shaped version of himself, worn thin by the weight of keeping 5 people alive. Anna kept detailed logs in a small leather journal, documenting expenditures in tight pencil script. Firewood. 9 cords at 30 cents per cord equals $2.70. Food staples. Flour, cornmeal, salt pork, dried beans. A can of condensed milk cost 15 cents. Candles for light. They could not afford to burn lamps during the day. She allocated $40 annually for heat, which left her roughly $140 for everything else: food, clothing, repairs, medicine, seeds for the garden when spring came. By December, with heat consuming double the expected amount because the winter was harsher than anyone had predicted, She was looking at shortages. She didn't tell Jacob about the shortages. She simply continued the rationing, giving him smaller portions when he wasn't looking, saving every edge and scrap and bone for broth. The wood stove, despite its theatrical glow, was an inefficient monster, radiating heat in all directions, but losing most of it straight up the chimney. A wood stove of that era might convert roughly 30 to 40% of the wood's energy into usable heat. The other 60 to 70% went up the chimney as exhaust, carrying warmth away from the family and into the Minnesota winter. The cold seeped in through every gap, every poorly sealed edge, every space between logs. Jacob could feel it, a systematic draining of warmth from the cabin, as though the frontier itself was drawing heat out of his home with deliberate malice. At night, he would sometimes stand in the dark and listen to the wind, finding every crack, every weakness, every place where his ability to seal out winter was incomplete. In January, their neighbor Magnus Harstad had lost 2 cattle and a goat to the cold. The animals had simply stopped moving. When Magnus found them in the barn, they were already freezing solid, their bodies locked in position, ice forming in their lungs as the last breath left their bodies. The frontier didn't just tolerate failure. It ended failure. By late January, as Jacob sat in his cabin, the idea began forming. Not clearly at first, just a feeling, almost a desperate imagining. What if the problem wasn't the stove itself, but where the stove was? What if he buried it? What if he took this cast-iron furnace, the heaviest, most valuable thing he owned besides his land, and he put it underground, beneath the cabin floor? The earth itself had thermal mass. The earth stayed insulated, stayed close to its base temperature. Even buried 3 feet down, the earth remained warmer than the air above it. What if he could use the earth as a thermal barrier, a heat distributor? What if the ground itself became the heating system? The concept was mad. It violated every principle of heating he understood, but it was also the only idea he had left. When he first explained the idea to Anna, she looked at him for a long moment without speaking. Then she said, "That's the most insane thing I've ever heard." Not angry, not mocking, just factual, the way someone states that a horse is brown or that it's cold outside. But then, after a pause, she added, "But maybe try it?" Because at that point in the winter, when the calendar still showed 6 weeks of cold ahead, maybe insane was worth attempting. She had started coughing in the early mornings, a dry cough that came from the cold, irritating her throat. She was starting to sound like the sounds that had preceded Magnus's neighbors' deaths the winter before. He began planning in secret, almost embarrassed by the idea, not wanting to be the man who buried his only source of heat. But by early February, when the cabin interior temperature never rose above 38 degrees even in daylight, when Anna's cough had developed into something deeper and more concerning, he started digging. The excavation began on a Monday in early February. Jacob marked out a rectangular pit, roughly 6 feet long and 4 feet wide, positioned directly beneath the cabin floor, centered in the main room. He and Peter began digging, and the work revealed immediately why no one had ever tried this before. The earth was frozen, mechanically frozen, with ice crystals binding the soil into near concrete. The ground around the cabin was so hard that Jacob's shovel would hit a foot of earth and bounce back up as though striking stone. The impact traveled up his arms, through his shoulders, jarring his spine. By late afternoon of the first day, they had dug 18 inches. By evening, Jacob's shoulders ached with a pain that suggested something might actually be torn, a deep grinding sensation that persisted even when he stopped moving. Peter's young hands developed blisters that bled into his gloves. Over the next 5 days, they dug deeper, 4 feet, then 4.5 feet, then 5 feet. The temperature actually improved as they went down, dropping only slightly but enough to notice. The deeper earth was slightly less frozen, holding enough thermal insulation from the summer months that the core was only 20 degrees below zero, rather than the 16 degrees of the surface. The pit walls took shape, rough but serviceable. They were learning, moment by moment, that they were beginning to engineer rather than simply digging a heating system that had to satisfy multiple contradictory requirements. The pit had to be deep enough to give the stoveroom and to position it below the cabin floor's center, but not so deep that the heat couldn't radiate upward through 3 feet of earth and wooden floor into the family's living space. The walls had to be sturdy enough that they wouldn't collapse inward under the weight of earth and stove, burying the cast iron in a jumble of mud and stone. The geometry had to be calculated for air intake and exhaust, for proper draft. For the complex physics of thermodynamic convection, Catherine kept a journal during this period, hidden in a cloth sack under her bed, where she recorded observations about depth, frost patterns, soil temperature, and the family's energy levels as the work progressed. She noted the color of the earth at different depths, dark near the surface, lighter brown as they went down, almost orange at the 5-foot level where minerals changed. She recorded the temperature of the earth at each depth, using a thermometer that had belonged to her grandmother. Years later, historians would find this journal and recognize that Catherine had been conducting systematic environmental observation at an age when most frontier girls were simply trying to survive. Her handwriting is delicate but precise, documenting the physical work and the emotional toll it was taking. She wrote that by the 3rd day of excavation, even with the constant physical work, Jacob's body temperature had started dropping. Anna had to insist he eat more, ration less, because he was burning calories faster than she could replace them. The math was brutal, a man doing heavy labor in extreme cold burns between 4,000 and 5,000 calories daily, sometimes more. Jacob was consuming perhaps 2,000. The deficit was being drawn from his body itself. By the 5th day, he'd lost 8 pounds. His ribs were starting to show clearly beneath his skin. Once the pit reached 5 feet deep, Jacob measured it obsessively, ensuring it was precisely the right depth. They began reinforcing the walls. The pit's walls were exposed earth, unstable and prone to crumbling. Jacob had salvaged stones from a collapsed section of fence line several hundred yards from the cabin, hauling them back in the sleigh across snow that was now thigh-deep. These stones, roughly fist-sized to head-sized, now came into use. They had to be fitted together as carefully as Jacob's minimal masonry knowledge would allow, with gaps filled with clay that Anna had helped him dig from a depression near the eastern property line. The stones were heavy, and lifting them, placing them, pressing them into position required exhaustion-level effort. He was building, without fully understanding it yet, a thermal chamber. The stones would conduct heat slowly, distributing it through the surrounding earth. The clay would seal it, preventing heat loss through cracks and gaps. Peter worked beside his father, learning with each stone, his young mind asking questions that sometimes made Jacob pause and think harder about what he was actually building. Why that angle? Why press the stones that way? Jacob would answer when he could, and when he couldn't. They would both stand looking at the problem until something close to understanding arrived. By the 8th day, the walls were complete. A rectangular vault of fitted stone beneath their cabin, 5 feet deep, lined with clay that Anna had tamped into place with her bare hands until her palms were raw and bleeding. She did this without complaint, without fanfare. She simply wrapped her hands in cloth and kept working, because working meant her husband's insane idea had a chance. The weight of the work was visible in her face now, the exhaustion competing with determination for control of her expression. The cast iron stove itself had to be lowered into the pit without breaking it or the cabin's support structure. The stove weighed 412 pounds, as Jacob had determined. A single man could not lift it. 2 strong men could barely move it. Jacob and Peter rigged a system of ropes and wooden pulleys, anchoring them to the cabin's supporting beam. They used rope that they couldn't afford to lose, rope that was meant for hauling supplies, rope that Jacob had saved from better winters. The descent took nearly an hour, with Jacob guiding the stove's weight down, while Peter managed the ropes from above, feeling the tension, adjusting the angle, ensuring that the massive iron didn't swing wildly and strike the stone walls. The sound of that massive iron descending into the earth, the scrape and clink of it against the stone walls, the bass note of its weight settling onto the prepared base, the groan of rope and wood under tension. Anna heard it from the bedroom where she was resting her aching hands. She told Catherine later that she knew in that moment that her husband was either a genius or he was going to destroy them all. There was no middle ground in a commitment that required burying your only heating source in the frozen ground of Minnesota winter. Once the stove was in place, secured at the bottom of the vault and settled onto a bed of sand and clay, the real engineering began. The stove had a flue outlet on top, on the back left side, where the chimney normally attached. Now, a chimney had to be built underground, angled upward at a steep pitch to force hot air and smoke upward and away from the cabin, eventually emerging outside. Jacob carved wooden templates to test angles, using pieces of scrap wood and a chalk line to mark angles on the cabin floor. He studied the flue opening obsessively, trying to understand the mechanics of draft, the pressure differences that would need to exist for smoke to travel through an underground chamber, through 3 feet of earth, and up a vertical shaft, before exiting into the Minnesota winter atmosphere. He built the chimney from fitted stones, starting at the stove's flue opening and rising at approximately 45 degrees. The stones came from the same salvage pile, carefully selected for size and shape. The work required precision that bordered on the obsessive. A stone that was placed wrong had to be removed and reset. Mortar that was too wet wouldn't hold the stone. Mortar that was too dry wouldn't bind one stone to the next. He made the mortar himself, mixing clay with sand in precise ratios, adding just enough water to make it workable. By the 3rd day of chimney construction, Jacob's hands had blisters on top of blisters, and the blisters were breaking open and bleeding into the clay he was working with. Anna wrapped his hands in cloth strips, torn from an old shirt, but he kept working. The blood slowly soaking through the cloth as he placed one more stone, then one more. Peter assisted, handing stones, mixing mortar, learning the mechanics of construction. Catherine watched and documented, writing in her hidden journal that her father's hands looked like something from a war, and she wondered if all progress required this kind of suffering, or if her father was just particularly stubborn about it. By the 11th day, the underground chimney was complete, rising from the stove's flue to the ceiling, angled at 45 degrees. It would emerge through the cabin floor near the northeastern corner, and then Jacob would extend it above the roofline to ensure proper draft. The stonework was clean, tight, professional-looking. Jacob stood at the bottom of the pit and looked up at what he'd built, and for the first time since starting this mad project, he allowed himself to think it might actually work. The air intake system was perhaps even more critical than the chimney. The stove needed fresh air to feed the fire. That air had to be drawn from outside the cabin, through the underground chamber where the stove sat, past the burning coals and into the fire, before the resulting hot gas and smoke went up the chimney. Without proper air intake, the fire would suffocate, drawing all breathable air from the cabin instead, and the family would be slowly poisoned by their own heating system, asphyxiating while sitting in their own home. Jacob designed an intake pipe, a hollow wooden conduit lined with clay, that would run from outside the cabin, beneath the frozen ground, and connect to the base of the stove's firebox. He had to dig a second trench for this pipe, another day and a half of work, and the pipe itself had to be angled upward slightly so that water from spring thaw wouldn't collect inside it and freeze when the temperature dropped. Peter dug this trench while Jacob worked on other details, and when they were finished, they'd essentially built a complete underground system: the stove, the exhaust chimney, the intake pipe, all connected, all positioned precisely beneath their cabin floor. By early March, the system was supposedly complete, or at least Jacob believed it was. The stove sat in its underground chamber surrounded by carefully tamped clay and stone. The chimney was built. The air intake was in place. The surrounding earth had been packed carefully in layers around the stove, each layer tamped down with wooden tools Jacob had carved, each layer a calculated effort to create a system that would conduct heat rather than trap it, to allow warmth to radiate upward while containing it enough that it would be useful. The wooden floor above had been carefully unsealed, repositioned, and sealed again around the chimney's exit point. The opening where the chimney emerged had been lined with clay and stone, fireproofed as best Jacob understood fireproofing to work in 1887, which was to say, mostly, he was guessing, based on intuition and desperate hope. Peter and Jacob had spent 14 days and nights building this system, sacrificing sleep, sacrificing food from the ration stores, sacrificing their bodies' ability to recover from the cold and the work. And then they lit it. The fire caught fine. Wood went into the firebox, heat began to build, and within 10 minutes the cabin began filling with smoke. Not a little smoke, a rolling, choking, gray-black cloud that made everyone's eyes stream tears and forced them outside into the cold, coughing and gasping. The smoke was acrid, bitter, chemical almost. Jacob's first instinct was panic. His second was rage. He had spent 6 weeks on this, had burned through resources they couldn't afford to waste, had taken his wife's rationed food and his son's healthy sleep, and the system was producing smoke instead of heat. The family stood outside in the 18-degree cold, coughing, trying to breathe clean air, and Anna's face had a look on it that Jacob would remember for the rest of his life. It wasn't anger. It was worse than anger. It was the expression of someone whose last hope had just been proven false. When they could breathe again, Jacob examined the problem. The chimney wasn't drawing. The smoke had nowhere to go, so it was seeping out of every tiny gap around the stove's base, through cracks in the clay, finding the path of least resistance, which led directly into the family's living space. Anna didn't say anything, but he could see her jaw tighten, and he knew that look meant she was adding up what this failure had cost them. $2.70 a month in firewood that they'd used testing a system that didn't work. 2 weeks of food, rationed below minimum levels. The wood for the pipes, the stones carried from half a mile away, the clay that had to be dug and mixed. He'd spent roughly $40 worth of resources. $40 that was a quarter of their annual budget for everything that wasn't heat. The issue, after careful analysis and a lot of frustrated diagrams drawn in the dirt outside the cabin, appeared to be draft. Hot air rises, yes, but it needs to have somewhere to go. It needs to accelerate to create pressure differences, to generate enough force to pull fresh air in through the intake and exhausts hot air up the chimney. The underground chimney was too long without enough vertical height at the end. The smoke was reaching the vertical section at insufficient temperature and pressure to be forced upward. Instead, it was pooling at the transition point backing up, seeking exit through any crack it could find. Jacob understood this intellectually, and the knowledge made it worse. He'd designed it wrong. His fault. Not the stove's fault, not the earth's fault, not nature's cruel indifference. His fault. Jacob spent 3 days completely dismantling and rebuilding the chimney. This time, he extended the vertical section. He extended it so high that it now went up through the cabin's roof, rising an additional 4 feet above the roofline. He recalculated the angle of the underground section. He made it steeper, closer to 50 degrees now. At night, he couldn't sleep. Turning over the geometry in his mind, imagining hot air molecules and pressure differentials, trying to think through thermodynamics with no formal education in physics, relying only on intuition and the increasingly desperate logic that something had to work, because the alternative was watching his family continue to suffer through a cold that was destroying them. Anna watched this process without comment, but her silence was its own form of communication. She worked beside him, removing stones, mixing new mortar, packing clay. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Jacob understood that he had one more chance, one more failure, and the family would face the rest of the winter, still 6 weeks away from spring, without heat from this system and without the resources they'd wasted trying to make it work. She would make it work because she always did, but they would both know what it had cost. She'd stopped eating breakfast now, giving those calories to Jacob. He'd noticed, and they'd had a brief, intense argument about it, which she'd won by simply continuing not to eat breakfast. The woman was starving herself so he could have the strength to fix his design. When they lit the system the second time, the smoke went up the chimney. All of it. The cabin stayed clear. The family breathed without choking, and Jacob felt a moment of triumph, so intense that he had to sit down because his legs suddenly couldn't hold his weight. Anna placed a hand on his shoulder, and that one gesture, acknowledgement without forgiveness, support without trust, told him that the system's success was tentative, that he'd solved one problem, but that there might be others. But the heat didn't come. The buried stove was producing wonderful draft now, pulling in fresh air, burning wood cleanly, creating heat, and directing it successfully up the chimney and out of the cabin. But somehow, that heat was staying in the chimney, dissipating through the stone and clay, being absorbed by the surrounding earth without ever radiating back into the cabin floor. Jacob's theory about thermal mass and conduction had been too simplistic. Heat didn't just magically jump from the stove to the cabin. It needed a path, a mechanism, a way to cross from the underground chamber to the family's living space above. The stove was glowing cherry red, burning hot enough that you couldn't touch the iron when it was firing, but the floor above it remained cool. Cool. Sometimes it felt almost cold. He reduced the amount of clay surrounding the stove, creating air gaps. The heat still didn't transfer effectively. He rebuilt sections of the clay, trying different densities, different moisture levels. Some days the floor would get slightly warmer, perhaps 45 degrees, but it would drop back down as soon as the fire was dampened for the night. Nothing he did seemed to create a stable transfer of heat. The cabin floor above the buried stove stayed room temperature, cool to the touch. Everywhere else in the cabin was cold. The one place where he'd invested 8 weeks of impossible work and had burned through irreplaceable supplies remained useless. The family slept a little further from the failure each night, returning to the kitchen stove, returning to the shifts, returning to the understanding that this wasn't going to work. Anna's patience, which had been infinite in the face of cold and hunger and fear, began to fracture under the weight of failed innovation. She didn't yell. She never yelled. But she started doing things with more force than necessary. She'd slam the water bucket down on the table. She'd tear bread apart rather than cut it. She'd wrap the children's blankets around them in jerky movements that spoke of frustration contained, but barely. Catherine asked her mother one evening if everything was all right, and Anna's answer was quiet and devastating. "Your father buried our only hope in the ground, and now we're all going to freeze anyway. But he's learning things, so that's what matters." Catherine understood in that moment what it meant when hope went from alive to fragile. It was Peter who suggested the problem during a late-night conversation. The boy had been thinking about heat, about how it moved, about why it seemed stuck beneath their feet. He'd been watching the system, studying it, learning from failure in the way that intelligent people do. He mentioned that when you stood near a cast-iron stove, the heat came through the air. You could feel it radiating, feel it filling the space around the stove, feel it moving across the room. Heat had to be able to move. If the earth around the stove was too dense, too packed, too sealed, the heat would just sit there, going nowhere. It would conduct slowly through the clay, losing energy with each inch it traveled. What if the earth needed to be porous? What if heat needed a medium to travel through, like air? What if the problem wasn't that there wasn't enough heat, but that the heat had nowhere to move to? Jacob looked at his 18-year-old son and understood, in that moment, that intelligence was not distributed according to age. The boy had solved the problem that Jacob's experience and desperation couldn't touch. Jacob's solution was radical and nearly catastrophic. He decided to fill the space around the stove not with solid clay, but with a mixture of clay and sand and loose earth, creating a thermal medium that was porous enough to allow convection, the circulation of heated air and earth particles that would radiate heat upward. The problem was that if the mixture was too loose, the stove would sink. If it was too porous, the earth would collapse inward. He was trying to engineer something that had never been engineered before, working in 3 dimensions with forces he couldn't fully see or measure. He had to imagine the world beneath his feet, had to visualize heat moving through earth and sand, had to trust that his intuition about physics, intuition based on no formal education, only on observation and thought, was correct. It took him 2 weeks to carefully partially dismantle the system and restructure the surrounding material. He left the chimney alone. That was working. That was the one part that wasn't broken. He kept the basic stone foundation and walls. But he changed the earth around the stove itself from solid packed clay to a carefully layered mixture of clay, sand, and small stones. The layers were compressed, but not densely compacted. They were designed to allow microscopic movement of heat-carrying particles, a kind of thermal circulation that Jacob understood intellectually, but could never quite articulate to anyone else. When he rebuilt the floor, he paid special attention to one detail. He left a thin layer of the insulating material, loose earth and sand, directly under the wooden floorboards. The wooden floor itself would conduct heat from the earth beneath it, and that heat would radiate upward into the cabin. It was simple in concept, but required precise execution. Too thin a layer, and the insulation wouldn't work. Too thick, and the heat transfer would be too slow. The 3rd attempt at starting the system happened on a cold evening in late March. The snow outside was beginning to show the first real signs of spring thaw, patches of brown earth visible where the wind had scoured the snow away. Jacob was running out of time. If this didn't work before April, he would have wasted 2 months of winter's precious final weeks on a system that didn't work, and the family would be facing next winter with even less than they had now. Next winter, they would remember this winter and know that it had actually been worse than it seemed. He lit the fire carefully, building it gradually, monitoring everything. The draft pulled the smoke up and out perfectly. The chimney worked as it had for the past 2 weeks. And then, after about an hour, something changed. Not dramatically, but noticeably. The air in the cabin shifted. There was a quality to it that was different. The temperature in the room began to climb, slowly but unmistakably. 1 degree per 10 minutes, 55 degrees, 58 degrees, 60 degrees. Jacob pressed his hand against the floor directly above the buried stove. It was warm. Warm, not hot, not scorching, but warm, real, genuine warmth that came from beneath the earth and through the wood and into his palm. He pressed his other hand in a spot 2 feet away. Warm. 3 feet away. Still warm. The heat was radiating upward from the earth itself, through the wooden floor, into the family's living space. Anna, who had been sitting by the window with her mending, set down her work and walked to the center of the cabin floor. Catherine came out from the bedroom, drawn by some instinct about what was happening. Peter emerged from the kitchen. The entire family stood on the floor above the buried stove, and they felt, for the first time that season, genuine warmth coming from beneath their feet. Anna knelt down and placed her palms flat on the wooden floor, feeling the heat rising into her hands. She was silent for a long moment, and then her shoulders began to shake, and she was crying. Not sobbing, just tears running quietly down her face as she felt the warmth that meant they would survive, that meant her children would sleep in rooms above freezing, that meant she had been right to trust her husband's insane idea, because sometimes insanity and genius were the same thing, just viewed from different directions. The temperature in the cabin rose to 55 degrees that night. 55 degrees. Jacob and Anna slept together in the same bed without rotating, without one person having to stay awake to tend the fire. They slept with their arms around each other, and they slept deeply, the sleep of people who finally understood that survival was not a question anymore. In the morning, the cabin was 52 degrees. By afternoon, with active fire in the buried stove, it reached 60 degrees. They opened a window briefly just to experience the contrast, the shock of outside air being colder than their home's interior. The wood consumption dropped dramatically. They were now burning perhaps 2 cords a month instead of 9. The family's caloric needs stabilized because the energy required to maintain body temperature dropped by roughly 20%. Anna stopped rationing quite so severely. There was actually enough food. Peter could sleep in the bedroom now, and he did, waking in the morning without the ache of cold-soaked muscles. Catherine could work at a table with steady fingers rather than cold, locked ones, and her handwriting improved immediately. And she took greater care with her appearance because she wasn't spending all her energy just trying to stay warm. The change was physical, yes, and it was psychological too. It was the difference between survival and something that resembled a life. Jacob spent a week carefully documenting the system so he could explain it to others. He drew diagrams in ash on wooden boards, then carefully transferred them to a proper sketch on paper that Catherine helped him obtain. He noted dimensions, angles, materials used, the ratio of sand to clay in the thermal medium around the stove. He created a complete technical specification for something that, as far as he knew, no one had ever built before. The diagrams showed every layer, every angle, every calculation. They showed the intake pipe angled upward slightly. They showed the chimney extending to 4 feet above the roofline. They showed the careful layers of earth and sand surrounding the stove, with notes about density and composition. The second week in April, Magnus Harstad came by. He'd heard rumors through the settlement that Jacob had done something with heating, something that involved burying a stove, something that was either brilliant or insane. He wanted to see it himself. Jacob showed him the system, lifting wooden boards to expose the stone chimney, explaining the air intake, describing the thermal mass surrounding the stove, demonstrating how the floor above radiated heat. Magnus listened, asked questions, ran his hands over the stonework, pressed his palm against the floor to feel the warmth. His initial skepticism didn't disappear, but it transformed into curiosity, and then into something approaching wonder. When Magnus left, he said only, "I'll be back next week with my son. I want him to understand this." He did come back the next week, with his son and 2 neighbors. Jacob spent an afternoon explaining the system, answering questions, defending design choices that might seem strange until you understood the physics behind them. By May, Magnus's cabin had a similar system installed. By mid-May, 3 other families had begun construction. By early June, 7 cabins in the settlement had buried stove systems. Word had spread to the neighboring town, a day's travel away. Settlers were writing letters requesting specifications and instructions. Jacob found himself, for the first time in his life, recognized not as a struggling farmer, but as someone who had solved a problem that affected every family in the frontier. Magnus became Jacob's advocate, traveling through the settlement and beyond, showing the diagram, explaining the system, describing the warmth and the fuel savings, and the simple fact that his cattle had survived the winter without significant loss. Where before Magnus's word might have been taken as the opinion of one man, now it carried the weight of visible success. Other farmers would come to Jacob's cabin in the spring to see the system for themselves. Some came skeptical, expecting to find some trick or some reason the system wouldn't work for them. But the evidence was too obvious. The house was warm. The floor was warm. The family looked healthier than they had any right to after a Minnesota winter. And the firewood stack had barely been touched. Anna, watching her husband in those spring weeks, as neighbors and strangers came to examine his system, saw something change in him. The constant tension that had defined him all winter, the tension of a man fighting an impossible battle, began to ease. He moved with less urgency. He smiled sometimes, not often, but enough that she remembered what he looked like when he wasn't terrified. Catherine asked her mother one evening if it was finally over, and Anna said yes, it was finally over. They had made it through. They would make it through the next winter, and the one after that. The frontier would always be hard, but it would no longer be actively trying to kill them. That summer, as the earth warmed and the snow melted away, Jacob made plans for the following winter. The system worked well enough for the coldest months, but he was beginning to understand it well enough to identify what wasn't perfect. He noticed that in late winter, when the fire burned almost constantly to maintain the warmth, the earth around the stove could become too warm, baking out the clay mortar in the chimney. He designed a ventilation solution, a secondary air valve that could redirect some heat outward rather than constantly upward. He calculated that if he could moderate the temperature slightly, using differential venting and careful management of the fire, the system would last longer and waste less energy. Anna, watching her husband in his workshop on summer evenings, sketching improvements to a system that was already revolutionary, asked him why he was still working on something that already worked. Jacob looked at the sketch, looked at his wife, and said that the difference between surviving and thriving was what you did after survival was no longer in question. Next winter, he said, would need to be better. Better meant less fuel, less constant work, more consistency, more reliability. Better meant other families could implement the system without the failures he had experienced. Anna understood then what she'd always known in some deep part of herself. Her husband wasn't built to solve problems once. He was built to solve them completely, to make them perfect, to turn desperation into science. By October, when the first real cold arrived, his improvements were installed. The buried stove system ran with remarkable efficiency. The cabin never dropped below 50 degrees, even on the coldest nights. Wood consumption dropped to just over 1 cord a month, a 90% reduction from the 9 cords they'd burned before the system existed. The system was so reliable that Jacob could leave the fire low during the day and simply stoke it before bed. It was freedom. It was a basic comfort that people in warmer climates took for granted, but that had been unimaginable to his family 6 months before. That first winter after installation, 3 other families in the settlement avoided serious illness because their cabins stayed above 50 degrees instead of dropping into the low 40s. One elderly neighbor, a man named Per Ostersten, who had nearly died of pneumonia the previous winter, survived the entire cold season without a single serious respiratory infection. He credited the warm cabin. He would have credited Jacob directly, but Jacob was already focused on the next problem, the next system, the next family who needed heat. By January, 5 additional families had begun construction on their own buried stove systems. By February, Magnus was teaching 2 other neighbors how to do the stonework. By the following spring, when surveyors came through and mapped the settlement, they noted with some surprise that 12 of the 16 structures in the immediate area had unusual chimney configurations emerging from above the roof lines at strange angles. The settlement recorded an unusual phenomenon. The area had experienced the lowest death rate from cold-related illnesses in the county's recent history. They didn't connect the 2 observations at the time, but eventually someone would. Eventually, the buried stove system would be written about in agricultural journals published out of the state capital. Eventually, it would be mentioned in history books as a small but notable innovation in frontier heating technology, an example of adaptation born from necessity and persistence. But in those first springs after success, Jacob didn't know any of that. He only knew that his family was warm. He only knew that the mathematics of survival had changed, that instead of spending 1/4 of his annual income on heat, he was now spending roughly $3 a year on minor repairs and maintenance. He only knew that sometimes, when you're facing an impossible problem that kills people, you dig a hole, you bury your most valuable possession in the frozen ground, and you trust that the earth itself might have what you need. The winter of 1888 would be the first time in a decade that Jacob Kresge didn't spend the season calculating how long the family could survive on the remaining resources. Instead, he spent it thinking about how to make the next iteration better. He and Peter designed a second system for the cabin's bedroom, positioned to supplement the main stove. He experimented with different ratios of sand to clay, seeking the absolute optimal thermal conductivity. He considered whether the system could be adapted for use in larger public buildings, community halls, maybe even schools. This was innovation as pure intellectual exercise, no longer driven by the desperation of survival. Anna made arrangements that second winter to have 2 neighboring families stay with them for the coldest weeks, giving them access to the warmth of the buried stove system while they were constructing their own. She prepared food. She helped manage the extra people in the cabin. She created a kind of informal school for the other family's children, where she and Catherine taught reading and basic mathematics. The warm cabin had become a gathering place, a place where people could spend an evening and remember what comfort felt like. In early March, she asked Jacob if he thought the system would have worked if she hadn't been willing to work it, to believe in it, to support it even when it was failing. Jacob considered the question carefully, and then he said no, it wouldn't have worked. It would have failed, and he would have blamed the system, and they would have continued burning wood and freezing, and slowly being killed by the winter. The system had worked because both of them had decided it would work, and they'd acted accordingly. By March, when the spring thaw began and the snow started its slow retreat northward, Jacob was already planning expansions. He sketched designs for systems that could be built in public buildings. He calculated the mathematics of scaling the system up for schools or meeting halls. He began to understand that his solution to one family's problem might have applications far beyond his own cabin. That innovation born from desperation could ripple outward, transforming the frontier itself. The knowledge that came with spring, the knowledge that they had survived, that they had thrived, that they had solved something that people had accepted as unsolvable, seemed to change how Jacob moved through the world. He walked with less uncertainty. He spoke with more authority about heating systems. He began traveling to neighboring settlements to show other families how to build buried stove systems, how to engineer them, how to understand the thermodynamics that made them work. By 1890, there were 43 documented buried stove systems operating in the Minnesota Territory, most of them built by families who had learned from Jacob's specifications and improvements. The death rate from cold-related illness in the region dropped by 60%. Children who would have been chronically ill in previous winters were healthy. Elderly settlers who had been preparing to leave the frontier because they couldn't handle the cold were able to stay, to remain on the land they'd claimed, to see their grandchildren grow up in homes that were warm. The system that began with desperation had transformed into a regional innovation, spreading through the network of frontier communities like warmth itself, reaching into cabins and replacing fear with the simple, profound comfort of adequate heat during winter. That shift in thinking from survival to improvement might be the most important part of the story, because frontier heating systems mattered, yes. Staying warm in Minnesota winters mattered, absolutely. But the moment when a man could stop asking whether his family would survive and start asking how he could make their lives better, that moment meant something else entirely. It meant that the frontier for this one family had stopped being about endurance and started being about progress.